They said he was a traitor, that no man deserved compassion after walking away from his own uniform, that there was no forgiveness for someone who refused to kill out of obedience. But I saw him wounded, covered in dried blood and dust, shaking more from fear than from pain. And when our eyes met for the first time, he didn't look like a traitor. He just looked like a man, too tired to keep on hating. My name is Virginia Belle Townsend, and I'm 93 years old. I live in an old house in the California countryside, surrounded by dry grapevines, creaking floorboards, and the quiet of someone who no longer has anywhere to rush to. My world fits inside a beige robe, a pearl necklace that's lost its shine, and a faded pillow I've carried with me for over half a century. No one ever suspected it. But that's where the secrets sleep, secrets the war couldn't bury. I was a war nurse in 1942, right in the middle of the Libyan desert, when the sun burned as fiercely as the fear, and the nights were colder than the silence between gunshots. I arrived with calloused hands and a steady heart, ready to follow orders, give morphine, and close the eyes of boys far too young to die. But war, the real war, wasn't just in the trenches. It lived in the choices no one saw, in the small gestures, in the long silences, and in men like him, who chose not to kill. Years later, they called me useless when I refused to marry a medal-decorated hero, said no decent woman would fall for an enemy. But nobody knew that inside my pillow. Slept dozens of letters written by a man the whole world wanted to forget. Letters he never sent, words he never translated. But I, even without knowing his language, understood them with my whole body. Because there was something in those shaky letters that gave me back what the war had taken away. The right to feel without fear. If you've made it this far, maybe you deserve to hear the rest. And I've finally learned not to keep everything to myself. So come in, sit down. There's warm tea in a chipped mug, and a blanket draped over the back of the couch. The night outside is damp and just right for listening. I promise I won't yell or rush. Just speak slowly, the way an emotional story should be told, with truth, with memory, with scars that ask for no pity, only to be heard. And if at any moment you feel this war story might touch someone beyond just the two of us, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with anyone who still believes that love, even on enemy ground, is the last breath of humanity we have left. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next, they never taught us in nursing school. Desert dust spared nothing. It slipped under your fingernails, clung to your eyelashes, stuck to your tongue like the earth itself was trying to keep you quiet. The first thing I learned there wasn't how to properly bandage a broken arm or how to change a dressing during a bombing. It was how to swallow sand without complaining, how to smile with grit between your teeth. Because there, on that American base nailed into the dry heart of Libya, women couldn't look weak or too human. And especially not empathetic to those on the wrong side of the war. I didn't know the name of what was waiting for me when I climbed down from the military truck. All I knew was that the heat rose lapsilo straight up from the soles of my boots and choked me from the inside out. The field hospital was made of olive gray canvas, crooked stakes, and metal tables that groaned. Everything reeked of cheap alcohol, sweat, and old fear. The wounded moaned nonstop, even after night fell. And the desert night doesn't know silence. It knows wind. Wind that cuts. Wind that carries the memory of gunshots and brings it back like a ghost. During my first week, I treated 12 soldiers with third-degree burns. Most of them didn't even scream anymore. They just stared at the ceiling like they'd lost the address to their own bodies. I followed the protocol. Wrote down name, serial number, blood type, Mother's name. There was something cruel about that order. Name. Number. Mother. Like we were asked to remember the boy just to shove him into anonymity. That's how war worked. It gave you a name just to erase it from the file later. And then he showed up. It was early afternoon when a group of soldiers brought him in. Not through the front entrance, not on any regular stretcher. They dragged him behind the storage tent, covered in a torn blanket like they were hiding a wounded stray dog. He was filthy, his face smeared with dried blood and sand. His arm dangled in a way I recognized. Severe dislocation, maybe a fracture. His eyes were half shut. But when they opened, there wasn't a plea in them. There was something older, something caught between regret and surrender. "He's a deserter," one of the soldiers whispered. "But the general wants him alive long enough to testify. After that, toss him in the mass grave." No one wrote down his name. They didn't give me a chart. He was just the deserter. And that was that. I should have walked away, followed the rules. But there was something about the absence of a name that hit me deep. He bled like the others, trembled like the others. But he was treated like his body wasn't human enough for a clean sheet. That night, after the tent emptied and the last scream faded, I went back to him with a damp cloth and a cup of warm water. His arm needed to be reduced. It was swelling fast. I asked him to try and relax, in English, but he just blinked. So I whispered in French, and then his eyes fluttered twice, slow, like they recognized something long forgotten. He answered back, thick accent, broken words but trying. The pain cut through everything. But the respect was whole. I reduced the dislocation gently. He screamed, then bit down on the edge of the blanket so he wouldn't scream again. I knew what that was. It wasn't just physical pain. It was humiliation. It was pride trying to survive inside the body of a man no one wanted to see standing again. The next day, I asked for an extra chart, took a blank sheet, didn't write a name. Just drew a small X at the top and wrote, "Unidentified." That's how I began what later became my nightly ritual. Each night before bed, I'd stop by, check his bandages, refill his water, leave a clean cloth by the basin. He didn't speak much, but his eyes did. And I started understanding more through silence than I ever had from any textbook. One night, I woke with a jolt. There was a sound of paper tearing from the back area. I grabbed my shawl and walked to his tent. The lamplight was dim, but enough to see. He was writing. Old paper, edges yellowed. A tiny pencil, barely more than a nub. He wrote slowly, bent over, like each letter had to carry the weight of what couldn't be said out loud. When he noticed me, he hid the paper. But one sheet had fallen, almost like he wanted me to find it. I bent down, picked it up. It was a letter, in German. I couldn't understand a single line. But that handwriting, it didn't have fury in it. It wasn't from a soldier. It was from a son, from a man, from someone still trying to remember he was a person before he became a uniform. I didn't ask, just closed my hand around the paper and left in silence. That night I hid the sheet between the pillowcase and the stuffing of my pillow, and I slept with my head on a secret no one else had the courage to carry. That was the beginning of my pillow story, my reliquary of untranslated letters, my silent pact with a man who had no name, but left scars I never wanted to heal. And that was only the first. Some wounds bleed outward, others bleed inward. The first kind you learn to close with gauze, thread, and patience. The second kind you only notice by the way someone breathes. Or how they stop breathing for just a second when someone enters the room. He was alive, yes, but he seemed suspended between watchfulness and abandonment. In those first days, the other nurses barely went near him. There was an unspoken agreement that deserters didn't deserve the same care. As if his wounds were different, tainted by a kind of pain no saline could wash away. And I understood. The worst bleeding that man carried came from a moral place. He bled on the inside, in places no test could detect. His fractured elbow stayed swollen even with bandages. His shoulder barely moved. There was an old bruise on his left flank, like someone had kicked him hard before he ever reached us. No one took responsibility. No one cared to explain. He was a traitor, they said. A German deserter. No rank, no country, no dignity. It was easier for everyone if he stayed that way. A half-drawn man the war had left behind. But I saw him. Every night before my shift ended, I'd quietly approach. I'd remove the dirty bandages with care, wipe him down with a warm cloth, refill his water slowly, so I wouldn't startle him. He'd watch me with a look that didn't ask for favors, but didn't quite know how to show gratitude, either. It was the look of someone who knew trust was no longer safe, but who, somehow, still allowed me to care. We didn't speak. There was something more intimate between us than words. The agreement of silence. I understood what his eyes asked, and he understood my gestures didn't come from pity. I didn't quite belong in that place either. An American nurse in the African desert surrounded by men who treated me like a high-end maid, good enough to clean up blood but not to give opinions. I was invisible during the moments of glory and essential during the moments of death. Maybe that's why I saw myself in him. Another functional human. Discarded. Useful. But excluded. One morning I noticed a shift. He started leaving his papers on the bed. Not hidden. Not folded hastily. They were there, out in the open, as if saying, "If you want to look, look. If not, just keep walking." I didn't touch them. Not yet. But I read them with my eyes. Studied the handwriting. The words. The same name repeated on nearly every page. Annalisa. I didn't need to speak German to understand. It was a woman's name. Short, intense. Maybe his mother. Maybe his sister. Maybe something more. But it wasn't just the name repeating. There were dates. Doodles. Tiny flowers drawn in the margins. Shaky letters like the hand behind them never fully stopped trembling. And alongside all of it, his skin began to heal. As if writing had become a kind of drainage. As if the words flushed out a poison no army or morphine could reach. One night I was redressing the wound on his scapula when I saw an old cut. Not medical, not from battle. It was thin, precise, like from a razor blade. A punishment cut, the kind the military reserves for those who try to walk away. I touched it with the tip of my finger, and he flinched. Not from pain, from memory. That's when I understood. He hadn't run because he was afraid. He'd run because he couldn't keep doing it. And that was a rare kind of courage. War made heroes of those who killed efficiently, but it made enemies out of those who chose to stop. That very night, I opened the pillow again. There were already 4 notes tucked between the layers of cotton. I took the 5th and folded it carefully, like preparing a tiny grave. Each page held a piece of a man the world wanted erased. And I, maybe for the first time in my life, wanted to save someone, not for his body, but for his memory. He didn't look at me with suspicion anymore. Now there was something different in his eyes. Relief. Not the relief of someone who had been saved, but of someone who had been seen. I started leaving small things beside his bed. A new bar of soap, a wooden comb, a button I'd sewn onto the pocket of his coat. Little gestures that seemed useless in the middle of a war, but said more than any polished uniform ever could. One day, as I was leaving, I heard a word slip from his mouth, low, hoarse. barely a whisper. Danke. It was the first time he thanked me, and the last. I walked out of that room, with my heart full of something I didn't have a name for. It wasn't pride. It wasn't pity. It was a kind of embarrassed tenderness, hidden like the letters inside my pillow. Something between care and surrender. Something between the war and what still managed to survive beneath it. That night I laid my head on the letters and realized they no longer belonged to him alone. They were mine too, because in them I heard the echo of what I myself could never say. That sometimes the only way to survive a war is to love what the world tells you to hate. And I no longer knew whether that made me a traitor or simply human. It all started with the sound of graphite scratching paper. It wasn't the frantic scribble of a man trying to unload his thoughts, or the rushed handwriting of a soldier desperate to get it over with. It was slow, dragging. A line that hesitated, circled back, then scratched again, as if he were drawing his own soul with a short pencil and trembling fingers. And in that moment, before I even saw what he was writing, I understood. That man was trying to stay alive, if only on the inside. It was a starless night, one of those when the wind made the canvas tents sway like widow's veils. The whole base felt suspended in time, caught between a bombing that never came and a silence that lasted too long. I left my quarters with the excuse of checking the gauze supply, but the truth was, I couldn't sleep anymore. And my body, or maybe my conscience, kept pulling me toward him, as if something unfinished lived there, something my duty as a war nurse couldn't name, but my soul recognized from far away. I reached the medical tent on quiet feet, like I always did, and before I even stepped inside I heard the sound, a line of pencil, a pause, another line. There was such care in that writing, it made me stop at the door and listen, the way you eavesdrop on a secret. When I finally entered, I saw him hunched over a yellowed sheet, elbows on knees, eyes buried in the lines he was creating. He didn't see me, or maybe he pretended not to. But I didn't interrupt. I stayed in the corner, leaning against the canvas divider, watching what might have been the only thing he still did by his own will. His elbow had already been set. The swelling was down. The wounds on his face were drying slowly, like crusted memories that refused to fall off. But his fingers were darkened, smudged with graphite. And I knew, with the certainty of someone who's seen pain that doesn't scream, that those hands had done things he could never erase. And that's why he kept writing, to try and wash some of it away, even if only inside his own mind. When he finally noticed me, he stopped writing. This time he didn't hide the paper. He just folded it slowly and placed it under his pillow. Then he looked at me, not with fear, not with shame, but with an expression I only recognized because I'd worn it myself in the mirror, a mix of, I don't know if I can trust you, with, please let me try. It was as if he were saying, I know I shouldn't, but I still need this to keep existing. I walked up to him with a basin of clean water and a cloth. I dipped the fabric and gently washed his fingers. The graphite didn't come off right away. It took several slow passes, like what clung to his skin was more than just charcoal. It was memory, guilt, resistance. He let me. His hands rested in mine like they knew this was the only time of day they could let go. Then he showed me something unexpected. He opened his left hand, closed it again, and when he opened it once more, there was a small folded piece of paper inside. He handed it to me without a word. I accepted it. It was a short letter, just a few lines. The same phrase written 3 times. Nicht vergessen! Nicht vergessen! Nicht vergessen! I don't speak German. I never have. But I knew what it said. Don't forget. 3 times. like someone trying not to erase, like someone writing to fasten their pain to the world. I didn't keep that letter in my pocket, or in the medicine box. I tucked it inside my pillow, between the worn-out layers of cotton, alongside the other notes that already lived there. Each one was a splinter of something he'd lost, or maybe something he never had, words that would reach no one. But somehow, for reasons only a silent love could explain, they felt like they were meant for me. The next night, when I returned, he had another paper waiting, and then another, and another. He never asked for anything, never smiled, just handed them to me, and I tucked them away with the same care someone uses to fold a clean sheet over a bloodied body. There was no ceremony, just ritual, an intimate pact formed without a single word. It was as if we were stitching together a story, and neither of us had the courage to say out loud. I started noticing the details in the letters. Sometimes he'd draw flowers in the corner. Other times, small faceless heads, like symbols of those who'd been silenced. Once he wrote a number, 104. Another time a date, April 14th. No context, no explanation, just fragments, scraps of a crumbling memory. And I pieced them together the way one sews an invisible quilt made of paper. One day he gave me a letter with my name at the top. Virginia, written with a trembling hand, like someone writing something sacred. It was the first time he named me, the first time I existed outside of my uniform. I read the lines with tears welling in my eyes, even though I couldn't understand the words. Because sometimes you don't need to understand the language to feel the soul that wrote it. That day I decided to replace my pillowcase. The old one was threadbare from too much opening and closing. I took a fresh one, stitched a tiny hidden pocket inside with thick thread, and placed all the letters there. I added a special stitch in the shape of a cross, like a symbolic seal, an intimate altar no one would ever step on, and I slept with my head over it, feeling the papers press against my neck like hands praying for me. What he didn't know was that those letters were saving me too. They were anchors in my days that kept drifting off course, proof that, even in a war, someone still chose to write instead of shoot, even if no one would ever read, even if no one else would ever know. And in that time when everything was rush and blood, finding a man who communicated with graphite and silence was, for me, like stumbling upon a spring of clean water in the middle of burning sand. He offered me letters, and I offered him the only vault I had left, the pillow where I kept everything the world wanted to destroy. He wrote like someone trying to stitch a broken body back together with a blunt needle. There was no rush, but there was no rest either. It was as if the words kept him breathing. Each line that formed on the page was a line that didn't exist on the flesh, a kind of survival made on the margins, where there were no witnesses, no forgiveness, only me. And even then sometimes I wondered if he was really writing to someone, or just writing to keep from disappearing. The letters began to pile up, one per night, sometimes two, some longer, others just torn notes scribbled on toilet paper or gauze wrappers. I hid them with meticulous care, always in the same place, stitched inside the pillowcase, next to the filling of my old pillow. Not for safety, but for reverence. That wasn't just writing. It was ritual, a reliquary, an intimate altar of a man who couldn't speak aloud because the world had already decided what he was. I remember the first time I saw something drawn in the corner of a letter, under the lamplight. It was a broken heart, split in half, with a different letter inside each side, A and V. I stood there frozen, my finger brushing the thick graphite line, as if I could feel the motion of his hand. Was the V for me? I didn't know, and I didn't dare ask. But the idea took root in me like a seed planted in shock. He was including me in his pain, even if unintentionally, even if in silence. There was also a kind of obsession with the word Zurück. It showed up in many letters. I later found out, after discreetly asking a German chaplain, passing through the base, that it meant return. And that crushed me in a strange way, because I knew he had nowhere to return to. No home, no army, no God who'd take him back. The only place those letters could belong was inside my pillow. The other nurses didn't ask much about him. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of boredom. Some called him the Mute, others the German Rat. And I kept to myself the name I never dared say out loud, Elias. It was written in one of the letters, not at the top like a recipient, but at the end, signed, shaky, like someone allowing himself just once to remember who he was before the uniform. Elias, the man who didn't shoot, who didn't scream, who didn't sleep, and who wrote letters to no one. In those long night watches, I would run my fingers along the pillowcase seam like it was a war map. Every letter inside was a trench, a territory conquered by memory. Sometimes I caught myself whispering words to him, words I told no one else. Things like, "You're still here," or "I kept them all," as if he could hear me through the fabric, even when he was just 2 steps away. Eventually, I lost track of how many letters I'd hidden. I stopped counting after 20, then 30. Some smelled of sweat and blood. Others were stained with tears. I don't know if they were his or mine, but all of them carried something that refused to die. One night, he surprised me. Instead of simply handing over the letter, he pointed at the pillow. His eyes locked on mine. Then he made a gesture with his hands, like stitching. And I knew. He knew. He'd always known. That I kept everything there. That my pillow was vault and confessional. That my nights were also made of pieces of him. And for the first time I saw a faint smile, barely there, form at the corner of his mouth. It was a pained smile, like someone thanking you when they don't know how. That same night, back in my quarters, I took out all the letters from the pillowcase. I laid a towel over the bed and lined them up one by one, side by side, like bodies in an emotional morgue. The shaky handwriting, the drawings, the repetitions, the name Annalise appearing more and more, the woman's name, maybe a mother, maybe a love. But in the middle of them all, one letter stood out. It was recent, written on a slightly pink page, unlike the rest. No date, no address. And in the center, my name, Virginia, surrounded by little circles like ripples around a stone thrown into a pond. I read every line, even without understanding the language. The words meant little to me, but the graphite told me everything. It was a letter of surrender, of confession, of farewell. And I cried, not for me, not for him, but for everything that's lost when we can't say, "I saw you," out loud. The next day, he didn't write. He stayed silent the entire time, staring at the ceiling like he'd accepted something only he knew. I did my routine, changed the dressing, collected the tray. But there was no letter, no gesture, just a silence heavier than usual. And the next night, again, nothing. He slept with his eyes half open and his fists clenched. I wanted to ask, but I didn't, because sometimes silence is the last defense of a man who's already lost everything. It was during that time I understood. The letters were never meant for anyone specific, not for Annalisa, not for me. They were prayers. Fragments of a faith he could no longer kneel to because the war had ripped the temples out of him. And I had become the only believer in his secret religion, the guardian of his final whispered words. Some people think war is only made of bullets and flags, but the war story I lived was made of folded paper, graphite-stained hands, and pillows that hid whole worlds. And Elias wrote like someone who still believed that one day someone would read, even if just to remember that he existed, even if just to say, I didn't know how to hate either. And there, among those unanswered letters, I understood that some loves don't need kisses or touch. They just need someone to keep them, to stitch them into a pillow, and protect them from being forgotten. It wasn't a room. It was a cell disguised as an infirmary. No windows, no ventilation, no opening that allowed even a sliver of natural light. The door was made of light iron, but it was always locked from the outside, with the latch turned toward the hallway like it was saying loud and clear, "What's in here shouldn't get out." And that's where they put Elias. No one gave a reason. They simply announced late in the afternoon that patient number 47 would be transferred. And deep down I knew it wasn't a transfer. It was confinement. He hadn't screamed, hadn't tried to escape, hadn't threatened anyone. But still, he was the deserter, the traitor, the one who spoke little and wrote too much. And in that war, that was more dangerous than any weapon. I remember the sound of the stretcher being pushed down the dusty corridor, the wheels sticking, dragging years of grit. He was lying down, eyes open, calm like someone who'd been expecting it. I followed behind, head lowered, stomach twisted. The door opened, the stretcher rolled inside, and the latch snapped shut. He stayed in. And I, on the outside, didn't know what to do with my hands. It took me 3 nights to convince them to let me in more regularly. I claimed daily care was necessary, cited infection risks and containment protocol. All lies, or almost. What I really wanted was not to leave him alone in that hole where time didn't pass, and the soul dimmed. When I entered for the first time, I brought one of my blankets, a jug of fresh water, and a lavender-scented soap my mother had given me before I deployed. Small things. But in that place they became symbols of resistance, as if saying, "You're still human." The space was narrow. 1 stretcher, a metal cabinet, a sink with a crooked faucet. The ceiling was reinforced canvas, but without vents. The heat hung like a dense fog. And the silence there wasn't silence. It was absence. Elias was seated against the wall, knees bent, arms resting on them, eyes fixed on a point that didn't exist. When he saw me, he blinked slowly. No words, just a slight loosening in his body, like he wasn't recognizing a person, but a pause in the torment. I started organizing the space, took off the old sheet, replaced it with a clean one, opened my small battery radio, which never really worked, just to fill the air with static. It kept the sounds of memory from taking over. Then I sat beside him on the floor, my back resting against the cold metal wall. And we stayed there, no talking, no moving, like 2 survivors who knew that if they spoke, the fragile balance might shatter. The next night I brought fresh paper. I placed it on the metal table, along with a sharpened pencil and a clean towel. He looked at the items like they were sacred offerings, nodded, barely. And later, before I left, he handed me a folded page. No envelope, no embellishment. Just a line drawn in the bottom corner, a continuous line, rising and falling like a heartbeat. And in the middle of it, a single break, like a pause, a loss, a death. That night I slept with the letter under my pillow and woke up crying. Not for him, for me, for everything that line had reminded me of. The bodies I'd already lost, the names I'd erased from charts, the eyes that died looking at me without asking for help. Elias, somehow, was drawing my own story with his lines. And it hurt, but it healed me too. The days inside that windowless room began to take on their own strange rhythm. I snuck in at the same time every day, brought bits of bread, dried fruit, moist towelettes salvaged from an old supply box. Sometimes a wilted flower picked behind the infirmary, just to remind us that color still existed somewhere. And he kept writing, more and more. One time he wrote on the back of a page, "There's no sky in here, but there's you." And that phrase, it never left me. I copied it into my notebook, scribbled it in the margins of the Bible my grandmother gave me. I stitched it into myself, the way I'd stitched his other words into my pillow. One afternoon, when the heat was unbearable and the infirmary fan had failed, he took off his shirt in front of me for the first time. And that's when I saw them. The scars on his back, thin lines, parallel, some crooked, others deep, belt marks, buckle marks, maybe even blade marks. I didn't ask. He didn't explain. But I understood everything. Understood why he ran, why he wrote so much, why he never spoke. His body was a wordless document, and I was its only reader. I started calling that space the room, even though I knew it wasn't. But somehow, we created a territory of our own, a little flagless nation, where war couldn't enter, where silence wasn't punishment, but refuge. And the only rule was, no one had to be who they were told to be. One night, I accidentally dropped a letter from my pocket. He picked it up, looked at it carefully, and smiled. A small, almost invisible smile, but it lit up that room like a beam of sunlight breaking through rubble. He knew I read them, that I kept them, that I felt them. And in that moment, without a word, he gave me something no one else ever had during that war, a sense of belonging. We weren't lovers, we weren't allies, we weren't confessors. We were two broken pieces of a world still trying to spin, even while bleeding. And in that windowless room, the only light that reached us was the one still alive inside us, humanity. And it was there, right there, that the pillow began to feel heavy. Because the more letters I hid inside it, the more I realized this wasn't just compassion anymore. It was love. A love that never had a name or a body or a time. But it had a place. A dark, stifling, silent place, and deeply, painfully real. The first time I saw blood spill across the Red Cross on a uniform was on an ordinary morning. One of those days that wakes already dirty with dust and broken promises. It was a Canadian nurse, a friend of mine, named Lucy. They moved her to another base after she was hit by shrapnel, in a zone where we, technically, weren't supposed to be. She wore the cross stitched in thick red thread over her left chest, like all of us did. We believed, or pretended to believe, that it protected us. But that day, the cross became a target, and everything changed. After that, I could never look at that symbol the same way again. I started noticing how the soldiers' eyes shifted when they saw the red mark. Some respected it, others mocked it, and some wanted us silent. Because they knew that under that cross were women with eyes that saw too much, hands that knew too much, memories that could tell too much. The cross didn't make us invincible. It made us inconvenient. That was when the rumors about Elias began. They said he was a spy, that his letters were codes, that he used my empathy as a shield to sabotage the base. I listened quietly, and as a good American, I knew what that tone meant. It wasn't just suspicion. It was preparation, a silent authorization for him to disappear. No guilt, no record, no mourning. Then, on a stifling morning, orders came down from high command. The colonel himself came to speak to me. Said I should keep my distance from the prisoner, that the interrogations were finished, that he was under special custody. I stood there, clipboard in hand, not yet grasping what was being said between the lines. Then he added, "We don't want martyrs, Townsend. Just silence." Silence. That word hurt like a slow bullet through the chest, because I knew what he meant. It wasn't about Elias. It was about me. About shutting down what I had felt. About burying what I had kept. About pretending the pillow didn't grow heavier every night. That afternoon, Elias's room was locked. None of the guards let me through. I sat on the back steps, sweat soaking my uniform, feeling the minutes drip down my spine like warm poison. That's when a soldier walked by, laughing with another, and said, "Her cross is crooked. Maybe that's why she likes the enemy so much." It hit me harder than any scream, because it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. All the women who loved wrong, who cared too much, who dared to see humanity where the world only saw threat. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pillow felt like it was breathing beneath my head. The letters inside it burned like hidden coals. Every fold, every graphite smudge, every seam carefully stitched. They all screamed, and I couldn't answer, because they had told me the cross only protects if it's in the right place. And I no longer knew where that was. The next day I got permission to see him. They let me in for 5 minutes. No paper, no pencil. Nothing in my hands. The room was dark, the smell stronger than usual. He was sitting, arms crossed, eyes hollow like caves. When he saw me, he didn't smile. But he didn't look away either. He just raised his right hand, slowly, and pointed to my chest, the cross, then pointed to his own, and then mimed a gunshot. I understood. He knew he wasn't seen as human anymore, but as a target. A body awaiting the end. A problem to be erased with the cold efficiency of someone scrubbing the infirmary floor. And even so, he still looked at me with tenderness. A sad kind of tenderness. The kind that doesn't beg, doesn't explain. Just offers itself as a final gesture of faith. I took off the fake pearl necklace from around my neck, the only adornment I had left, and gave it to him. Not for value, but as testimony. Because sometimes the only way to say, "You changed me," is to give what's left when the world has stripped everything else away. He accepted it, closed his hand around the necklace, and lowered his eyes. That was the last time I was allowed to see him up close. In the days that followed, the base fell into a strange kind of euphoria. The war was advancing, they said. Orders were being fulfilled. Morale was rising. And I could only think about how the cross stitched into my uniform no longer meant protection, but punishment. On the third night, I removed the pillowcase. It was unraveling, the seams strained by the weight of the letters. I reinforced each stitch with dark thread, nearly invisible. And for the first time, I added a new symbol. In the lower corner, I sewed a small tilted cross, crooked, imperfect. My cross, the one that didn't protect me, but also didn't let me forget. Elias's story was never recorded. No report, no official note. They said he was transferred. But I knew. We all knew. Some bodies vanish without the world needing to explain, and some truths are buried before they're ever spoken aloud. But what remains, what still pulses, is the sound of a pencil scraping paper, the graphite under the nails, the heat of a windowless room, the weight of a cross that one day stopped protecting and started accusing. And I still sleep with his letters beneath my head. Not out of nostalgia, not out of guilt, but out of fidelity, because there are stories that only survive when someone chooses not to forget. And my pillow is still the trench where I hid everything the war tried to erase. There's a kind of fear that doesn't come with screaming or running. It settles in slowly, like dust gathering in the corners of your soul. You go on doing everything as before, folding sheets, cleaning instruments, smiling out of obligation. But inside, there's a constant vertigo, a feeling that at any moment, someone will press exactly where you've hidden what little courage you have left. That's how I lived in those days, like someone walking across floorboards that only creak where you know to step lightly. The letters inside the pillow had grown in number. Dozens now, sewn into double layers, some on paper so thin it turned translucent when the desert sun filtered through the tent. I slept with my face against words that weren't mine, and woke with damp eyes, as if that pillow had become a spring of silent grief. It was comforting, and dangerous. I knew that. On the afternoon when everything nearly fell apart, the heat was stifling. The sand danced in tight little spirals near the infirmary, and the air felt heavier, like time itself was hesitating. I was preparing a new batch of sterilized bandages when I heard the footsteps. They weren't like the others. They were rhythmic, heavy, like hammers on stone. The sound of boots that walked with authority. And when the door opened, I knew something was about to shift out of place. The inspection commander stepped in, flanked by 2 officers, and a new nurse sent from another base to observe local procedures. All of them smiling, all of them polite, but their eyes swept over everything with surgical precision. And it was with that kind of forced politeness they announced the inspection. They would be reviewing the conditions of the barracks, the nurses' conduct, and personal belongings. Protocol, they said. Precaution. Morality. I felt my blood freeze under my uniform. The words were sewn into the cotton of that pillow, silent, but alive, breathing. They could be found. They could be opened. They could be read. And what terrified me wasn't just the risk to myself, but to him. Because Elias was no longer just a patient, no longer just a wounded body. He was a living memory of something the base wanted erased. And the letters were proof, testimony, fragments of a humanity that contradicted the reports. I took a deep breath and kept calm. The inspection started with the stretchers, the medicine shelves, the antiseptic cabinet. They noted everything, commented on everything. With each drawer they opened, my stomach tightened. There was nothing illegal there, but what I was hiding wasn't made of objects. It was made of choices. And in that war, choices could be crimes. When they got to my cot, my skin flushed hot. The commander pulled back the sheets, lifted the pillow, pressed it, prodded it with his fingers. It was firmer than the others, yes, heavier. But I masked it with a calm smile and a rehearsed phrase. I prefer fuller pillows, sir. I tend to get migraines. He chuckled. The new nurse furrowed her brow. One of the officers stepped closer, and then the corner of the pillowcase came undone. It was a misaligned stitch. A loose thread I should have reinforced. A slip. A small tear from which the tip of an aged page peeked out. I saw it. Saw the paper emerge like a tongue of fire begging to be seen. And before he could touch the pillow, my body did the only thing it knew to do. I collapsed. A controlled faint. A perfectly timed fall. I threw myself against the nearby stretcher. Let my elbow hit the metal loud enough to draw attention. They rushed to me. The inspection halted. The commander ordered water. They said it was exhaustion, heat, stress, and I made myself fragile, like I'd never allowed myself to be before. In the confusion, I saw the pillow set aside. No one opened it. No one insisted. They laid me down with a damp cloth on my forehead and orders to rest for the day. I stayed still. Inside, I was trembling. Outside, I breathed slow and steady. And when they finally left me alone, I held that pillow like it was a child about to be taken from me. I cried quietly, for the first time in weeks. Not from fear, but from rage, from knowing that in that world, even guarding someone's memory was a risk. That night I reinforced the stitching with double thread, sewed with a bleeding finger like sealing an open wound. And as I pushed the needle through the cotton, I made a vow to myself. Those letters would not be burned, nor forgotten, nor surrendered. If someday they had to be destroyed, I'd swallow them one by one. But I'd never let them be used against him. Elias didn't write that day, nor did he meet my eyes. But when he handed me back his empty food tray, he left behind a single object, one of my fake pearls, the one I thought I'd lost weeks before. It was dirty, stained with rust, but it was there. And that was more than a gesture. It was a vow. His silence told me, I kept something of yours too. In war there are no coincidences, only choices. And I had made mine. I knew they could come back to inspect again, that they could stitch a lie bigger than my makeshift seam. But I also knew his story wasn't meant for the trash. It was meant to be protected. Even if the world called me a traitor, even if the cross on my chest lost all its meaning, even if, to keep hiding that love, I had to start hiding from myself. From that day on, I started using 2 pillows, one for sleep, the other for memory. No one ever suspected, but inside me, a crack kept growing. Sooner or later, someone would come looking again. And when that happened, I'd either be ready to lie again, or ready to tell everything. The first time I saw my name written by him, it felt like it had been stitched into the paper itself. It wasn't just ink. It wasn't just graphite. It was a line carrying hesitation, reverence, and risk. Virginia. 7 trembling letters. A simple name. But in that handwriting it sounded like a confession. As if, until then, he had only called me with his eyes. And now, finally, dared to touch my existence with the most intimate thing he had left. A written word. It was a gray morning, the kind where the desert heat seemed to have forgotten to rise. The sky hung over us like a massive canvas, stretched tight with foreboding. I entered his room in silence, as I always did. I carried dry bread, a clean towel, and a fresh bar of soap, one of those with a gentle scent that, if we were lucky, masked the mustiness of that place. He was sitting with his legs crossed, holding a folded piece of paper. When he saw me, he said nothing, just held it out. I took the note with fingers that couldn't hide their tremble. It wasn't rare for him to give me letters, sketches, scraps of thought, but that paper, it was different. Firmer, cleaner, thicker, like it had been saved for a special occasion. And when I opened it, the first thing that took my breath away was this. My name written at the top, surrounded by space, like the title of something sacred. Virginia, it read. And the rest was in German. Short phrases, words I didn't understand, but they moved like a dance between regret and tenderness. There were fingerprints along the edges, maybe graphite, maybe sweat. At the end, a small symbol was drawn, an open circle with a dot in the center. I stared at it for a long time, trying not to understand it with my mind, but with my body, and what I felt couldn't be translated into any known language. It was recognition. It was farewell. It was gratitude. I returned to my quarters with the note hidden beneath the waistband of my apron. I sat on the bed and pulled it out carefully. Instinctively, my fingers reached for my chest where the pearl necklace used to hang. Ever since I'd given it to him, I felt like something was missing. But at that moment, I understood that he had given me something far greater in return. My name. My name, spoken by someone who wanted nothing back. Someone who had seen me beneath the rolls, the uniform, the war. I decided that this note wouldn't be stitched in with the others. It was too special. It needed its own space. I opened the inner seam of the pillowcase, right in the center, and made a small division, a secret pocket inside the hiding place. There I sealed the paper like making a pact with time. I slept with my face pressed to the new seam, feeling a kind of quiet peace, as if my body understood that this gesture was a hug in the dark. In the days that followed, I noticed subtle changes in Elias. He seemed less tense, less guarded, not confident, but there was a resignation in his shoulders, a softness in his eyes. He still wrote, but not as often. Sometimes he just sat in silence, staring at the ceiling, his brow furrowed. When I asked if he wanted water, he nodded. When I changed his bandages, he kept his eyes closed longer, as if, little by little, he was preparing to disappear. On the 4th night after the note, he handed me a blank page. Yes, blank. Not a single word. Just a faint fingerprint in the lower corner. When I looked at him, puzzled, he simply gave me a faint smile, and I understood. That page was for me to write on, for me to place something of myself there too. But I didn't write, not that day, not in the days that followed, because everything I needed to say was already stitched into the seams I'd sewn. And everything he needed to hear was already in the way I looked at him. Still, I kept the blank page, folded the same way, slipped into the same secret pocket where I'd hidden my name. It was like a mirror, a space left open for everything unspoken, for what would never be said. Sometimes the most real love doesn't live in the words we say, but in the ones we protect. One night I caught myself wondering how he would pronounce my name if he ever dared. If there were time. If there were no war. And I imagined his voice saying Virginia with a broken accent, a dry throat, like the syllables weighed more than they should. And that image made me smile, alone, in the dark, a small smile, but whole. That same night I dreamed of him, a soundless dream, but one filled with the smell of wet sand and the golden glow of lamplight. He handed me the necklace back, but instead of pearls, it was made of letters. Each bead, a letter of my name. 7 beads, 7 letters. A necklace that said everything, without saying a word. I woke with my heart tight, and went straight to the pillow, opened the seam and took out the note, ran my fingers over the letters of my name like one strokes a photograph. Then I folded it again, kissed the crease, and tucked it back in. Not out of fear, but out of loyalty. It was mine, it was his, it was ours, and no one needed to know. In war, some wounds leave visible scars, and some names heal more than any medicine ever could. He gave me his, without ever saying it, and I gave him mine, and he wrote it. And in that world with no windows, no flags, no dawn, that was the closest either of us would ever come to the word love. There was no alarm, no shouting, no siren, no goodbye. It was as if someone had pulled an invisible thread and unraveled, in one swift motion, the entire fabric where he'd been stitched. One moment, he was presence, a body with warmth, weight, silence. The next, he was absence, like a footprint wiped clean by wind before anyone could see it. It was early morning. I'd woken with that feeling only those who carry a secret in their chest understand, that the world sometimes decides to change without asking your permission. The sky was clear, too clear, almost white. The light streamed through the cracks in the ceiling like blades of heat. I got up following the same ritual. Uniform, clipboard, dry bread hidden in my pocket. But something in the air felt different, as if the desert were holding its breath, as if something had been ripped away, and the space it left behind was still floating. I walked down the infirmary corridor, exchanging half-hearted nods with sleepy soldiers. I reached the door of the windowless room. I stared at my feet for a second, and when I lifted my eyes, the door was already ajar. That's all, just ajar. And that was enough. I pushed it gently. The metal groaned, a sharp sound like a held-back cry. Inside, nothing. The bed, too, neatly made. The pillow placed with military precision. The towel I'd left hanging now, folded in a perfect rectangle by the sink, the water basin empty, the pencil that always sat on the table. Gone. And him. Gone, too. I didn't need to ask. Didn't need to scream. Didn't need to run to the command post. I knew. Knew it with the same certainty that had driven me to hide letters inside a pillow. He had been removed, transferred, erased. Pick a word. The truth was he was no longer there. And no one had told me. No one thought they needed to. I stood in the middle of the room, feeling his absence wrap around me like smoke. The air felt heavier, like whatever life was left in that space was trying to say something. And then I saw it, on the floor, near the bed, nearly hidden beneath the cot. A tiny scrap of paper. I knelt, picked it up with both hands. It was crumpled, blank. No words, just a single line. A long straight mark drawn from one end of the page to the other. Like a cut, like a timeline suddenly broken. I went back to my quarters with the paper tucked in my apron, sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for hours. I didn't cry. Not yet. Because part of me still hoped. Maybe he'd been taken to another post. Maybe he was ill. Maybe they'd decided to keep him in secrecy. I clung to anything that might keep me from accepting what was already clear. He had vanished like muffled sound, like a story torn before the final page. But it was at the end of that day that the truth hardened. One of the nurses came to me with a box. She said it was unclaimed personal items found in the infirmary storage. Inside, a used bar of soap, a scrap of cloth, and my necklace. The fake pearls. He'd left it with me, then returned it. And now, it was being returned to me again. The center pearl was cracked. A thread dangled loosely. I picked it up with shaking fingers and felt like I was holding the last trace of something the world tried to erase, but couldn't. That's when I cried. Really cried. Not for the days that had passed, but for the ones that would never come. I cried for the letters he would never write, for the words that would never be translated, for the sound of his pencil scratching paper that I would never hear again. And most of all, I cried because I didn't know if he'd left in fear or in peace. And that question haunted me for years. That night I reopened the pillowcase for the last time. I took out every letter, one by one, with care, spread them across the bed like preparing a wake. I read the lines, even without understanding, kissed the note with my name, held the blank page he'd given me, and in the middle of it all, I left a space, an empty square of fabric left unstitched. It was the place for what was never said, for what was missing, for what hurt too much to be written. Then I tucked everything back inside, sewed it shut with triple thread, and made myself a promise. No one would ever touch it. No one would ever destroy what we lived between the silences of war. Because love, when it's real, doesn't need a will. It just needs someone who refuses to forget. And I refused. Even now, when I lay my head on the pillow, I still feel the weight of the letters, still hear the sound of graphite, still see my name written by him, with hands that trembled not from fear, but from hope. He disappeared without goodbye, but what stayed never left. Sometimes time doesn't pass. It hides. It lingers behind the closet door, buried in forgotten sheets, in the static of a radio that still crackles at night, in the creak of floorboards when the wind shifts. I've lived alone for years now, beside this quiet lake, and I swear I've learned to hear time standing still. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And that night, it whispered his name. I had left the window open, like I always do when the air gets too thick to sleep. The sound of water tapping against the hull of the trailer was calm, almost hypnotic. But something felt different, a heaviness in the air, an absence that felt like a presence, as if someone was standing outside in silence, waiting for me to notice. And I did. I got up slowly, walked to the bed and sat down with the pillow in my lap. The same pillow, gray, stained, stitched so many times it looked like a map of scars. I ran my fingers along the central seam, still firm, still sealing what I never showed anyone. But when I touched the lower corner, I felt it. The thread had loosened, a weak spot, a small opening, but enough. The seams were beginning to give. It wasn't just the fabric. It was the silence, too. Everything I had buried inside me with each letter. What I had kept under control all these years with warm tea, polite smiles, and organized solitude. All of it was starting to break open. And I knew, right then, on that damp July night, that I couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't hide, couldn't keep it in. I reached for the scissors in the drawer. My hands trembled, not from fear but from reverence, as if I were about to open an old coffin. I cut the center stitches gently. One by one, the letters began to slide out, like dry leaves in a late autumn. They fell into my lap softly, as if they had waited their whole lives for this moment. I held them in both hands, arranged them into neat piles. Then I looked at them like someone facing an altar. Elias came back to me that night, not in flesh, but in handwriting, in the curved lines of a language I still don't understand, but that has become the only one capable of naming what I lived. He was in every letter, every smudge, every pencil stroke. And I was there too, in the blank spaces, in the silence between phrases, in the hidden pocket where I once placed my name next to his. I cried. For the first time in years, I cried without restraint, without disguise, without hurry. And with every tear, a letter seemed to breathe, as if it was finally being read by time. I didn't need a translation. What mattered was right there, not in the words, but in their very existence. The war tried to erase Elias, but I stitched him into the fabric of my life. I slept with the letters spread all around me. I woke to the light of dawn spilling into the room like a whisper of redemption, made coffee with trembling hands. And then I decided. I picked one letter, the first one, the oldest, the one that still smelled of the desert. I folded it carefully, took a fresh envelope, wrote only, "For those who still believe that love chooses no side," and I left it on the table. In the days that followed, I sewed a new pillowcase, wider, stronger, but I left a small opening, like a visible scar, a reminder. Because now, I didn't need to hide anymore. The seams had opened, and with them, my will to tell. But not as a denunciation, not as revenge, as memory, as tribute, as a war story that never made it into the books, but lives, intact, inside the pillow of an old nurse who refused to forget. They say time takes everything, that memory fades, that the body gives in, that love, when unfulfilled, turns to dust inside us. But there are things time cannot take. There are names that survive in the dark. There are stories that keep breathing beneath a pillow, even when everything else has fallen asleep. I never got the chance to see him leave. They gave me no explanation, no apology. No soldier came to tell me where he was buried, or if he was buried at all. But somehow, I have always known. The body may vanish, the name may be erased. But the gesture? The gesture survives. And his gestures, so small, so silent, are all still here. In the letters, in the stitches, in the blank spaces. I spent my life surrounded by words that weren't mine. But they saved me. Elias never promised me anything. Never swore love. Never asked me to stay. But he gave me something no one else ever did in that war. The chance to be remembered for who I was, not who I was told to be. He wrote my name with a graphite-stained hand. And with it, he also wrote my dignity, my courage, my story. Today, at 93, I still sleep with that same pillow. The letters are still inside, like prayers without an altar. Sometimes I take one out, read it with my fingers, feel it with my face, kiss it with closed eyes. Not just out of longing, but out of loyalty. Because loving someone in silence is also a kind of eternity. If you've listened this far, I want to thank you with all my heart. Maybe you've never hidden letters inside a pillow, but if you've ever tucked away feelings the world wouldn't accept, then in a way, you and I understand each other. And if at any moment during this story something tugged at your chest, know this, it means there's still tenderness in you, and that is worth more than any medal. If you can, leave a comment. Share this video with someone who needs to believe that love still exists, even when the whole world works to erase it. Subscribe to the channel. With every story told, another seam opens, and a silence is finally undone. And remember, sometimes what cradles an old woman's head is the sweet weight of a love no one ever knew existed. Take care, my dear, and thank you for staying until the end.